The Battle of Arawe was fought between Allied and Japanese forces during the New Britain campaign of World War II. The battle formed part of the Allied Operation Cartwheel, and had the objective of serving as a diversion before a larger landing at Cape Gloucester in late December 1943. The Japanese military was expecting an Allied offensive in western New Britain, and was reinforcing the region at the time of the Allied landing in the Arawe area on 15 December 1943. The Allies secured Arawe after about a month of intermittent fighting with the outnumbered Japanese force. The PT boat base was subsequently deemed unnecessary and was never built. Only a small Japanese force was stationed at Arawe at the time, although reinforcements were en route. The main Allied landing on 15 December was successful, despite a failed subsidiary landing and problems coordinating the landing craft. American forces quickly secured a beachhead and dug in. Japanese air units made large-scale raids against the Arawe area in the days after the landing, and in late December Imperial Japanese Army troops unsuccessfully counterattacked the American force. In mid-January 1944, the American force, reinforced with additional infantry and tanks, launched a brief offensive that pushed the Japanese back. The Japanese units at Arawe withdrew from the area towards the end of February as part of a general retreat from western New Britain. There is no consensus among historians on whether the Allied offensive at Arawe was necessary. While some have argued that the landing served as a useful diversion ahead of the Cape Gloucester operation, others believe that the entire campaign in western New Britain was unnecessary, and that the force employed at Arawe could have been better used elsewhere. Background: military situation in July 1942, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff directed that the main objective of the Allied forces in the South Pacific and Southwest Pacific Area commands was to capture the major Japanese base at Rabaul on the eastern tip of New Britain. From August 1942, U.S. and Australian forces conducted a series of offensives in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, with the goals of eliminating Japanese positions in the region and establishing air bases close to Rabaul. The Japanese forces in the area mounted a strong resistance, but were unable to stop the Allied advance. In June 1943, the Allies launched a major offensive, designated Operation Cartwheel, to capture Rabaul. During the next 5 months, Australian and U.S. forces under the overall command of General Douglas MacArthur advanced along the north coast of eastern New Guinea, capturing the town of Lae in the Huon Peninsula. U.S. forces under the command of Admiral William Halsey, Jr., simultaneously advanced through the Solomon Islands from Guadalcanal, and established an air base at Bougainville in November. In June, the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that it was unnecessary to capture Rabaul as the Japanese base there could be neutralized by blockade and aerial bombardment. MacArthur initially opposed this change in plans. It was endorsed by the British and United States Combined Chiefs of Staff during the Quebec Conference in August. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters assessed the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific in late September 1943, and concluded that the Allies would attempt to break through the northern Solomon Islands and Bismarck Archipelago in the coming months en route to Japan's inner perimeter in the western and central Pacific. Accordingly, reinforcements were dispatched to strategic locations in the area in an attempt to slow the Allied advance. Strong forces were retained at Rabaul, however, as it was believed that the Allies would attempt to capture the town. At the time, Japanese positions in western New Britain were limited to airfields at Cape Gloucester on the island's western tip and several small way stations, which provided small boats traveling between Rabaul and New Guinea with shelter from Allied aerial attacks. On the 22nd of September 1943, MacArthur's General Headquarters directed Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Alamo Force to secure western New Britain and the surrounding islands. This operation had two goals, the first of which was to establish air and PT boat bases to attack the Japanese forces at Rabaul. The second objective was to secure the Vitiaz and Dampier Straits between New Guinea and New Britain so that convoys could safely pass through them, en route to conduct further landings along New Guinea's north coast and beyond. To this end, GHQ directed that both Cape Gloucester and Gasmata on New Britain's south coast be captured. This offensive was codenamed Operation Dexterity. The 1st Marine Division was selected for the Cape Gloucester operation, and the heavily reinforced 126th Regimental Combat Team from the 32nd Infantry Division was to attack Gasmata. Senior Allied commanders disagreed over whether it was necessary to land forces in western New Britain. Lieutenant General George Kenny, commander of the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, opposed the landings, arguing that his forces did not need airfields at Cape Gloucester as the existing bases in New Guinea and surrounding islands were adequate to support the planned landings in the region. Vice Admiral Arthur S. Carpenter, commander of both the 7th Fleet and the Allied Naval Forces, Southwest Pacific Area, as well as Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbie, commander of Task Force 76, supported occupying Cape Gloucester to secure both sides of the straits, but opposed the landing at Gasmata as it was too close to the Japanese air bases at Rabaul. The Gasmata operation was cancelled in early November in response to the concerns raised by Kenny and the Navy, as well as intelligence reports that the Japanese had reinforced their garrison there. On the 21st of November, a conference between GHQ, Kenny, Carpenter and Barbie was held in Brisbane, at which it was decided to land a small force in the Arawe area. This operation had three goals: to divert Japanese attention from Cape Gloucester, to provide a base for PT boats, and to establish a defensive perimeter and make contact with the Marines once they landed. It was intended that PT boats operating from Arawe would disrupt Japanese barge traffic along the southern shore of New Britain and protect the Allied naval forces at Cape Gloucester from attack. Geography: the Arawe area lies on the south coast of New Britain, about 100 miles from the island's western tip. Its main geographical feature is Cape Mercus, which ends in the L-shaped Arawe Peninsula. Several small islands called the Arawe Islands lie to the southwest of the Cape. In late 1943, the Arawe Peninsula was covered by coconut trees which formed part of the Amalut plantation. The terrain inland from the peninsula and on its offshore islands was swampy. Most of the shoreline in the area has limestone cliffs. There was a small unused airfield 4 miles east of the neck of the Arawe Peninsula, and a coastal trail leading east from Cape Mercus to the Pullier River, where it split into tracks running inland and along the coast. The terrain to the west of the peninsula was a trackless region of swamp and jungle, which was very difficult for troops to move through. Several of the beaches in the Arawe area were suitable for landing craft. The best were house firemen on the peninsula's west coast and near the village of Umtingelu to the east of the peninsula's base. Prelude. Planning: Alamo Force was responsible for coordinating plans for the invasion of western New Britain. The Arawe landing was scheduled for the 15th of December as this was the earliest date by which the air bases around Nadzab in New Guinea, which were needed to support the landing, could be made operational. This date also gave the landing force time to conduct essential training and rehearsals. As Arawe was believed to be only weakly defended, Kruger decided to use a smaller force than the one which had been intended for the landing at Gasmata. This force, designated the Director Task Force, was concentrated at Goodenough Island, where it was stripped of all equipment not needed for combat operations. Logistical plans called for the assault echelon to carry 30 days' worth of general supplies and enough ammunition for 3 days of intensive combat. After the landing, holdings would be expanded to 60 days' worth of general supplies and 6 days' worth of all categories of ammunition other than anti-aircraft ammunition. for which a 10-day supply was thought necessary. The assault force and its supplies were to be carried in fast ships which could rapidly unload their cargo. The commander of the PT boat force in the Southwest Pacific, Commander Morton C. Mummer, opposed building extensive PT boat facilities at Arawe as he had sufficient bases and Japanese barges normally sailed along the north coast of New Britain. Mummer took his concerns to Carpenter and Barbe, who eventually agreed that he would not be required to establish a base there if he thought it unnecessary. Instead, he assigned 6 boats stationed at Drega Harbour in New Guinea and Kirawina Island to operate along the south coast of New Britain east of Arawe each night, and asked only for emergency refueling facilities at Arawe. The Director Task Force's commander, Brigadier General Julian W. Cunningham, issued orders for the landing on the 4th of December. He directed that the task force would initially capture the Arawe Peninsula and its surrounding islands and establish an outpost on the trail leading to the Pullia River. The main body of the Director Task Force was to land at House Fireman Beach on the Arawe Peninsula at about dawn. 2 troop-sized forces would conduct separate operations about an hour before the main landing. 1 troop was to capture Pitto Island to the peninsula's south, as it was believed that the Japanese had established a radio station and a defensive position there which commanded the entrance to Arawe Harbour. The other troop was to land at Umtingelu and establish a blocking position on the coastal trail east of the peninsula. Once the beachhead was secure, amphibious patrols would be conducted to the west of the peninsula in an attempt to make contact with the Marines at Cape Gloucester. U.S. Navy personnel on the planning staff were concerned about these subsidiary landings, as a nighttime landing conducted at Lae in September had proven difficult. Opposing forces. The Director Task Force was centered around the U.S. Army's 112th Cavalry Regimental Combat Team. This regiment had arrived in the Pacific in August 1942, but had not seen combat. It was dismounted and converted to an infantry unit in May 1943, and undertook an unopposed landing at Woodlark Island on the 23rd of June. The 112th Cavalry Regiment was smaller and more lightly armed than U.S. infantry regiments, as it had only 2 battalion-sized squadrons compared to the 3 battalions in infantry regiments. Moreover, the squadrons were smaller and more lightly equipped than their infantry equivalents. The 112th RCT's combat support units were the M2A1 howitzer-equipped 148th Field Artillery Battalion and the 59th Engineer Company. The other combat units of the Director Task Force were 2 batteries of the 470th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, most of the 236th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, a company of the United States Marine Corps 1st Amphibious Tractor Battalion, and a detachment from the 26th Quartermaster Wall Dog Platoon. The 2nd Battalion of the 158th Infantry Regiment was held in reserve to reinforce the Director Task Force if required. Several engineer, medical, ordnance and other support units were scheduled to arrive at Arawe after the landing was completed. Cunningham requested a battery equipped with 90mm anti-aircraft guns, but none were available. The U.S. Navy's Beach Party No. 1 would also be landed with the Director Task Force and remain at Arawe until the beachhead was secured. The Director Task Force was supported by Allied naval and air units. The naval force was drawn from TF-76 and comprised U.S. Navy destroyers US Cunningham, Shaw, Drayton, Bagley, Reed, Smith, Lamson, Flusser and Mahan, and a transport group with destroyer transports US Humphreys and Sands, the Australian landing ship infantry HMAS Australia, landing ship dock US Carter Hall, 2 patrol craft and 2 submarine chases. The naval force also included a service group with 3 LSTs, 3 tugboats and the destroyer tender US Rigel. United States Army Air Forces and Royal Australian Air Force units operating under the 5th Air Force would support the landing. but only limited air support was to be available after the 15th of December as the available aircraft were needed for strategic missions against Japanese bases. Australian coastwatchers stationed on New Britain were reinforced during September and October 1943 to provide warning of air attacks from Rabaul, bound for the Allied landing sites, and to report on Japanese Bajan troop movements. In addition to a coast-watching team already in place at Cape Orford near Wide Bay, 5 other parties were sent to Cape Hoskins, Gasmata, Open Bay, the area south of Wide Bay, and the neck between Wide Bay and Open Bay. The Gasmata party was discovered by the Japanese while en route to its destination and eliminated, but the other teams were in place by the end of October. At the time of the Allied landing, the Arawe area was defended by only a small force, though reinforcements were en route. The Japanese force at Arawe comprised 120 soldiers and sailors organized into temporary companies drawn from the 51st Division. The reinforcing units were elements of the 17th Division, which had been shipped from China to Rabaul during October 1943 to reinforce Western New Britain ahead of the expected Allied invasion. The convoys carrying the division were attacked by U.S. Navy submarines and USAAF bombers and suffered 1,173 casualties. The 1st Battalion, 81st Infantry Regiment was assigned to defend Cape Mercus. However, it did not depart Rabaul until December as it needed to be reorganized after suffering casualties when the ship transporting it from China was sunk. In addition, 2 of its rifle companies, most of its heavy machine guns and all its 70mm howitzers were retained by the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, leaving the battalion with just its headquarters, 2 rifle companies and a machine gun platoon. This battalion, which came under the command of Major Masamitsu Kimura, was a 4-day march from Arawe when the Allies landed. A company of soldiers from the 54th Infantry Regiment, some engineers and detachments from other units were also assigned to the Arawe area. The ground forces at Arawe came under the overall command of General Matsuda, whose headquarters were located near Cape Gloucester. The Japanese air units at Rabaul had been greatly weakened in the months prior to the landing at Arawe by prolonged Allied attacks and the transfer of the 7th Air Division to Western New Guinea. Nevertheless, the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet had 100 fighters and 50 bombers based at Rabaul at the time of the landing at Arawe. Preliminary operations. The Allies possessed little intelligence on Western New Britain's terrain and the exact location of Japanese forces, so they flew extensive air photography sorties over the region, and small ground patrols were landed from PT boats. A team from Special Service Unit No. 1 reconnoitred Arawe on the night of 9/10 December and concluded that there were few Japanese troops in the area. The Japanese detected this party near the village of Umtingelu and strengthened their defenses there. Operation Dexterity was preceded by a major Allied air offensive which sought to neutralize the Japanese air units stationed at Rabaul. From the 12th of October until early November, the 5th Air Force frequently attacked the airfields around the town as well as ships in its harbor. Aircraft flying from U.S. Navy aircraft carriers also attacked Rabaul on 5 and the 11th of November in support of the USMC's landing at Bougainville. The Allied air forces began pre-invasion raids on Western New Britain on the 13th of November. Few attacks were made on the Arawe area, however, as the Allies hoped to achieve tactical surprise for the landing and did not want to alert the Japanese to their intentions. Instead, heavy attacks were made against Gasmata, Ring Plantation and Lindenhafen Plantation on New Britain's south coast. The Arawe area was struck for the first time on the 6th of December and again on the 8th of December. Little opposition was encountered on either occasion. It was not until the 14th of December, the day before the landing, that heavy air attacks on Arawe were conducted. Allied aircraft flew 273 sorties against targets on New Britain's south coast that day. In addition to these air raids, A force comprising 2 Australian and 2 American destroyers bombarded the Gaza area during the night of 29–30 November. The Director Task Force was concentrated at Goodenough Island in early December 1943. The 112th Cavalry was notified that it had been selected for the Arawe operation on 24 November, and departed Woodlark for the short voyage to Goodenough Island in 2 convoys that sailed on 30 and 31 November. All elements of the regiment were ashore at Goodenough by 2 December. A full-scale rehearsal of the landing was held at the island on 8 December. This revealed problems with coordinating the waves of boats and demonstrated that some of the force's officers were insufficiently trained in amphibious warfare. There was insufficient time for further training to rectify these problems. However, each of the regiment's rifle squads received a Browning automatic rifle and a Thompson submachine gun, and a number of 2.36-inch bazookas. Rifle grenades and flamethrowers were also issued. The cavalrymen received little training on the use of these weapons, however, and did not know how to make the best use of them in combat. The invasion force boarded transport ships during the afternoon of 13 December, and the convoy sailed at midnight. It proceeded to Boona in New Guinea to rendezvous with most of the escorting destroyers and made a feint north toward Finschhafen before turning toward Arawe after dusk on 14 December. The convoy was detected by a Japanese aircraft shortly before it anchored off Arawe at 3:30 a.m. on 15 December, and the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul began to prepare aircraft to attack it.